And it is probably the most talked about social media documentary that we've had in the last few years. It's got lots of people talking. The Social Dilemma basically is, how do you put it? It's like a Voltron's-like collection of all the things that social media are doing to our brains that's bad. Jeremy, does that work as a functioning description of it?
Yeah, pretty much. It kind of sums up all the issues about social media and kind of wraps them up into a 90-minute documentary, ranging from like misinformation and disinformation to surveillance capitalism. And, it features a lot of interviews with former executives of like Twitter and Google and Facebook who've kind of come around the bend and said, have we designed systems that are actually kind of destructive and too addictive? Perhaps the general public maybe isn't quite aware of some of the software design and human interaction decisions that went into them. For some people, it'll be very informative, but it also doesn't get into a lot of the solutions to some of the problems as well.
Is it wrong, Natasha, that I'm somewhat cynical about a whole bunch of tech executives who got their gazillion-dollar payouts and then discovered their consciences to come on this documentary? Is that cynical of me?
I think it's totally fair to be cynical with some of the tech executives who have actually been featured, like Tristan Harris and Jaron Lanier. These guys have been writing for years, like the polemics against social media. Jaron Lanier literally wrote 10 reasons to delete your social media accounts now. So not only are these the guys who've kind of been on the inside, made their gazillions and then gotten out, but they're on the most extreme end of the spectrum in terms of arguing against what Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. have become. So they've got a certain position in Silicon Valley. They're now making, I guess, a different kind of money and value from arguing against it. But yeah, a little bit of cynicism. Why not?
Come on, I think his name is Tristan from memory.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I would not want to mispronounce Tristan.
Tristan. All right, so Jeremy, one of the things that's happened since the documentary's come out is that Facebook have issued a multi-part takedown of the film and all the different things it gets wrong. Of the various different things they point out, they talk about addiction, they dispute the idea that if you're not paying for something, you are the product. They talk about algorithms and how much data and the work they've done with polarization and elections and misinformation. Do you think Facebook were unfairly, just as to pick one social media company, do you think they were unfairly maligned in the film?
I don't expect Facebook to agree with anything that's in the film because consistently over the years, they've batted away any concerns about its service whatsoever. And there are legitimate concerns around misinformation. There are legitimate concerns around how much time someone spends on the platform. There are concerns about its effect on minors and their own sort of self-worth and self-esteem. I don't think it's necessarily unfair, but I do think that the film does focus a lot on the negatives of social media, and there are positive things about it as well. So when you look at a film that on the whole is extremely sort of negative, I think that it's not quite balanced per se.
Natasha, are there points in there that Facebook have come back with that you think are reasonable, that maybe are worth pointing out?
Facebook are basically saying, look, yep, you're right. There are issues with the attention economy. There are issues with the fact that social media is a poor emotional substitute for real intimacy. There are potential issues with targeted advertising or political echo chambers. They don't fully concede the seriousness, but they acknowledge some of it. But what Facebook then say to the makers of The Social Dilemma is that in the making of this film, you haven't acknowledged what we have done or what has changed from, say, 2016 to now, 2020. And that's a long time in social media world. You know, they've got global heads of policy. They've got new different people in place who are trying to directly address some of those concerns.
Anytime if you make a documentary, you have to talk to the other side. And when you talk to a handful of executives who've left and are also getting a lot of attention because their stance is contrary to, sort of the conventional wisdom, you have to have balance. And so it probably would have been good to at least have Facebook's public policy director or, talk about things like, screen time limits and things like that. But in the interest of fairness, you do need to speak to all parties.
Look, all human beings need a better understanding of what software engineers are doing. Given that we're using this tech every day, let's try and become more literate in how and why it has been built. And when you realize that Instagram is essentially a virtual shopping mall, you can be like, okay, that's what it is. That's why the Explore feed displays items of clothing or places I'd like to go to based on all my past interactions with this platform, because the software engineers are treating me as a potential consumer, like a would-be consumer. So I'm a big advocate for kind of, pulling back the curtain on what the engineers are doing, but maybe not in this sort of like, they're all evil scientists out to manipulate us, because I just don't know if that's a very convincing characterization of the relationship, even if there is some truth to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the documentary points out, the whole point of a lot of these engineering efforts were to get people engaged with the platform and grow user bases. And they did that really well. In fact, the gentleman who designed the Facebook like button, they actually just designed it to make people feel good. So there wasn't any sort of underhanded intention there. But at the same time, these definitely are very addictive platforms. And it kind of begs the question of like, well, what do you do about it? Can you tell all these billion-dollar companies to build less attractive products that people won't use as much? That doesn't make sense. And, another compelling argument too, made by someone else, one of the other interviewees, was that there is just so much money underpinning these companies that to have these companies try to engineer themselves to be less attractive also poses a threat to this enormous financial threat to people who have shares in these companies, which makes it also very unlikely that there is going to be any sort of change.
Well, you can see the film The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which, of course, does not at all make use of algorithms to change your behavior at all. All right, there is lots more of this in the podcast to download this show. You can find it wherever you podcast. See ya.